Hi everyone! Today I want to talk about how to start reading in foreign languages. This video will be useful for anyone who is learning a foreign language and would like to start reading, especially books in this language. I personally read in 5 languages. Russian and Ukrainian are my native languages, and I've been reading in English for years, and I also read in German and Croatian. My first foreign language was English. That's the language I started reading in first as a foreign language, and later I used the same techniques and approaches with German and Croatian so that I could read in those languages as well. Today I want to talk about the mistakes people most often make and share some tips on how to start reading in a foreign language even if it feels difficult, impossible, and like there are tons of unknown words and vocabulary. I really hope this video helps you get rid of fear and doubts and start reading in foreign languages as soon as possible. This video will be in 2 parts. The first part of this video will be about what to read in a foreign language, and the second part will be about how to read it. Please don't forget to like this video, leave a comment and subscribe to my channel if you're interested in foreign languages, productivity and self-development. Recently, I was scrolling through threads and came across a post by a girl who wrote that she started reading her first book in English, and that book was Women Who Run with the Wolves. In the same post, she admitted that reading was really hard and there were many new words, like way too many unknown words, and she was asking for advice on how people actually start reading in English. When I saw that post, I honestly felt sorry for her because even for me, with many years of experience reading in English, that book was really hard to read. I tried reading it only a year or two ago, and it's a very specific book. If you read it, you know, there is a lot of vocabulary that you simply don't encounter in everyday life and maybe never will. Of course, there is some normal everyday vocabulary, but there is also a huge amount of rare, very specific words. So I hope by now you're already getting my first point. Your first book should not be difficult. Of course, you can't know in advance whether a book will be easy or hard, but when choosing a book in a foreign language, it's much better to try to pick something simpler, something closer to real life, to everyday situations, rather than folklore, mythical stories, or discussions about female archetypes. That kind of content is quite challenging. The biggest mistake beginners make is choosing a book that is too difficult for them. For example, when I saw that post on Threads, I thought, if that had been my first book in English, I probably wouldn't have wanted to read in English for a long time, simply because it's too hard. My first book in English was The Little Prince. I chose this bilingual edition with Russian and English, and I wouldn't say that this book is extremely useful in terms of vocabulary, but it's not that difficult and it's quite easy to follow. Starting with something like this is much more enjoyable than the previous one. If your level is still quite low, let's say it's really hard for you to read books at all, that's exactly why graded readers exist. These are the same books you'd like to read, but rewritten specifically for learners in simpler language without complex vocabulary. I read one of those versions and it was really much easier than reading the original. So if you want to start reading and it's still very hard for you to read books in the original, try graded readers first. I'm sure it will be much more pleasant experience for you because the vocabulary is simpler, but the meaning of the book is it's preserved in this graded readers version. Also, if books are still too difficult for you, you can start with short articles online, blogs, or adapted texts. For example, for English, there is a resource called News in Levels, where you can read news in different levels. They are written for beginner, for intermediate, and for advanced learners. But I know that we're all here to read books in the original, so I'm not going to recommend you children's books or fairy tales. Personally, I found them completely uninteresting, except for The Little Prince, but okay, let's say that one is more for adults anyway. It's not a children book. I wanted to read things that genuinely interested me while combining this with language learning. And by the way, this is actually a huge advantage, reading something you're genuinely interested in. Of course, if you're a fan of fantasy or classic literature, it can be a bit more challenging. I wouldn't recommend starting with classics, fantasy, or fiction in general, if these are your first books in a foreign language. There is a lot of vocabulary there, especially in scene descriptions, adjectives, figurative expressions. That's where many people get stuck and burn out. Dialects are usually easier to read, but as soon as detailed descriptions start, the difficulty level jumps really fast. I'd recommend starting with non-fiction books that you're actually interested in. For example, at one point I was really into psychology, self-development, and productivity, so I started reading books in English exactly on those topics. Since I already knew the vocabulary in my native language and was familiar with the subject, it was easier for me to remember new words, and reading was genuinely enjoyable. And books about self development and productivity are usually written in fairly simple language, which makes them comfortable to start with. For example, I read The Mountain is You in English. It's quite easy to follow. I also read a lot of books about languages. Again, because I was familiar with the topic, it made it much easier for me to absorb the vocabulary. So, my advice is choose books on topics that genuinely interest you. Sports, nutrition, hobbies, your profession, anything that is relevant to your life. These kinds of books usually have fewer complex literary expressions. The language is simpler and the vocabulary is really useful. It is something you can actually apply in real life. Of course, if you really want to read fiction or fantasy, go for it, but I personally leave it for later when your level improves and you can truly enjoy these kinds of books in the original. My second piece of advice about reading in a foreign language is this: choose books you've already read in your native language. This is especially true for your favorite books, the ones you know really well. For example, The Little Prince for me, I first read it in Russian and then in English, and then the process continued. German, Croatian. I was also gifted the original French version because I studied French at university, but I haven't gone back to it yet. Hopefully, I will. Or here is 1984 by George Orwell. That was my second book in Croatian. It is a complex book. It is not non-fiction, it is fiction. But the first book in Croatian for me was this Luki, about the happiest people on earth, and it was quite easy to read. So 1984 is the book I already read in Russian before, so I knew what it's all about. That's why I chose it to read in Croatian as well. This is a truly effective life hack. It's much more easier for your brain when it already knows the context of the book and what's going to happen. That way you can really focus on learning new words, expressions, I don't know, grammatical structures, instead of trying to understand the story itself. When you pick up a book you haven't read before, your brain is trying to process vocabulary, context, and the plot all at the same time. And that makes reading much harder. When the book is already familiar, you can really focus on the language itself and practicing new words and so on. Even though the main goal here is language practice rather than pure reading pleasure, I still found it interesting to read The Little Prince in a new language each time. And even though I generally don't like rereading books, I don't do it in the same language, only in different ones. Alright, I hope by now we've figured out what to read in foreign languages. Let's move on and talk about how to read. One of the biggest mistakes beginners make is translating every single unfamiliar word. You won't last long doing that. It gets boring really fast and you end up sitting on one page for hours. You don't need to do this. Even if it feels like, but I really need to understand everything. What really matters is grasping the context of the book first. So you can try reading a paragraph or a page and see how much of the meaning you can get. Some details might stay unclear, it's okay, but the overall context should make sense. If the context is clear, you can keep going. Only translate words that are absolutely essential to understanding, or words that appear repeatedly and, yeah, maybe I should translate this word, it's important. But you don't need to translate every single word. That will kill your motivation and the joy of reading. If you read at least half of the book this way, you'll notice your language skills improving already. You'll see words more often, translate them a few times, gradually remember them, and then get used to sentence structures and the author's style. And by the time you reach the second half of the book, reading will already be much easier. The main takeaway here is don't translate every word. Translate only what's truly necessary to understanding the meaning. The second very important rule for reading in a foreign language is consistency. If you sit down for a couple of hours once a week, of course that helps a bit, but it's much more effective to read every day for 10-15 minutes. Even a page or two a day is better than an hour once a week. Consistency matters in any skill, and reading is no exception. You won't learn a language in 10 minutes a day, but for improving your reading skills and your vocabulary, it's far more effective than occasional, let's say, marathons. Sometimes motivations show up. You sit down, you read, translate, you get tired, and that's it. Next week, you will need motivation again, and the motivation might not be there. So if you make reading a frequent habit, every day or at least every other day, progress will show up much faster. Some days you might not feel motivated, but seeing visible results after a month or two becomes motivation itself. That's why it's important to read regularly, not in bursts. If you're writing down new vocabulary from your books, try to practice it afterwards. You can make your own sentences with this vocabulary. You can put these words into flashcards or ask ChatGPT to create a table with vocabulary and exercises for you. Just in a bit, I'll tell you how I do it, and I find it really useful. But yeah, practicing vocabulary after reading is useful because in one book, some vocabulary repeats quite often throughout the story, and if you practice it at the beginning, it will be much easier for you to read the rest of the book later. And also, I want to add a little note for lovers of physical book, which I am myself as well. When I first started reading in English, those online tools either didn't exist or I didn't know much about them, but now when you download a book to your phone, you can pick any word and instantly see the translation just by clicking on this word, and you don't have to write it down every word manually. These tools, on one hand, they help you enjoy reading without constantly stopping to translate, but on the other hand, they can really take away the brain's time to process new vocabulary. Personally, I really like reading physical books, as I said, opening a book, sitting somewhere with it, drinking coffee or lying in bed, feeling the pages. Writing down words by hand or even on your phone with translation and saving them takes more time, but that time gives your brain a chance to process the word or a phrase. Because of that, new words really stick better than if you just quickly click on a translation and move on. You can compare it to scrolling short form content versus watching a long form video. If you spend 20, 30 minutes or an hour watching a long video that tells you about one topic, your brain gets the time to process this information, and there is a much better chance you will remember it later. But when you spend 30 minutes or an hour scrolling, you might see, wow, such a great video, a cool life hack, I'll use it. Or wow, great exercise, I'll do it next time on my workout. Or wow, this is a great recipe, I should try it out. You think it at the moment, but then you close your phone, and in 1 hour, if someone asks you, what do you remember? Like, you'll forget 90% of the videos you watched because your brain didn't get enough time to process that. So don't worry if you love physical books and they don't have this instant translation features. The more time you spend with your new words, new vocabulary, the more attention you give it, the better you'll remember it. Ebooks and apps are convenient, yes, but sometimes they can slightly reduce the memorization process. It's different for everyone, of course, but the main thing for us here is to enjoy reading and find the method that works best for you personally. And I also promise you to tell you how I work with vocabulary. Sometimes the same word has multiple meanings. When you're reading a book and come across an unfamiliar word, the first meaning you see might not fit in the context at all. The word could be used differently as a part of an idiom or as a slang, for example. Here is what I recommend, or what I do usually. When I'm reading a book in a foreign language and come across an unfamiliar word or a phrase, I use Google Translate with the camera feature. Yeah, I point my camera at the sentence and I look at the translation of the whole sentence in context. That way, it's immediately clear how the word is used, and it's fast and convenient. So you don't have to scroll through a lot of meanings of the word to find the right one. Of course, Google Translate can make mistakes sometimes, but I still find it very convenient to just check the word in the context and understand the context better. And then, if I think that this word is important and I want to save it, I used to write it manually in a notebook before and it worked well, but nowadays I'm a bit lazier and we also have ChatGPT. So here is what I do. I open a new chat with ChatGPT and I write it ask, I'm going to send you new words in German, for example, translate them and give me examples and sentences with this new vocabulary. And ChatGPT does it right away, so it gives me the translation, it gives me the examples, it gives me the sentences with new word, it gives me some explanation about this vocabulary. I don't read them right away, right? I just send the new words to ChatGPT. And then when I finish reading my book, I have the whole list of new vocabulary written by ChatGPT for me with examples, with translations, with explanations of how this word can be used and so on. I find it super convenient. I don't have to spend a lot of time writing down new words, but I still spend some time, sending those words to ChatGPT. And then at the end of the reading, I have a great opportunity to work with this vocabulary however I want. So this was my how to read in foreign languages. I hope my tips and recommendations were helpful and that you enjoyed watching this video. If so, please like it, leave a comment about how you read in foreign languages. Maybe you have your own hacks that we don't know or tips, share them. It would be really interesting to read. I wish you all success in reading in foreign languages. Thank you so much for watching and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.